Welcome to episode 3 of our 5 Themes of Geography video series. This one is going to focus on the geographic theme of place. And the basic question we're asking when we're talking about place is, what's it like there? So we're taking a look at an area. We're trying to find out what characteristics are in that area that can give us some clues about what we can find there. So the first category we usually put these things into are physical characteristics, and these are going to be anything that is made by nature, that comes from nature. So things that would belong in this category would be landforms, mountains, plateaus, plains, prairies, that sort of thing. Water features, whether it's giant saltwater bodies of water like oceans and bays and seas and sounds and gulfs, or is there freshwater like rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. Flora and fauna are very fancy words that just mean plants and animals. Flora means plants, fauna means animals. That can give us clues about an area as well. The types of rocks, whether that's sedimentary rocks, metamorphic rocks, igneous rocks, those all give us clues about an area. The climate, of course, would give us clues about an area, and then there are lots of other features as well. The other category would be human characteristics. And these are aspects of an area that are constructed or built by humans and developed by humans. So this would include structures like buildings and dwellings, the types of buildings, the types of homes, that's what a dwelling is, that people live in an area would give us some clues about it. The modes of transportation that are used by people, and of course those change over time. We have planes now, which we didn't 150 years ago. We have trains that are much faster now than old style trains. That kind of gives us clues about an area, even about areas that are currently that we see in the world now. There are different modes of transportation that are used in different parts of the world and different sections of the world. And the last part is culture and cultural characteristics. So we're back at Google Earth, and I'm going to use this to show the effect of some physical characteristics on people and on areas. I'm going to do a search for Mount McKinley, which is now officially known as Denali. There it is, which is the original Native American name for the mountain. It's a mountain in Alaska, which we're going to be zooming to right now. Here we go. And it is actually the tallest peak or summit in North America. It's over 20,000 feet tall. If we look down here at the elevation, if I hover over where Denali is, you can see in the corner there it says 20,091 feet, and that's going to vary, but that's basically at its peak. That's how high it is. If we look here, now first of all, it's in Alaska, which doesn't have a lot of people to begin with, and that's more of a climate thing because of how cold and harsh the temperatures are for most of the year. But the mountain range itself also kind of prevents people from settling there, at least in large numbers, because there's really no place to grow crops. It's a rocky, high peak. The air is thin. It's freezing cold. If you can't grow crops, you can't eat. And if you can't eat, well, we know what happens when you don't eat. So usually the higher the elevation of an area, the less people you're going to find there. You don't see a lot of really big city centers and that sort of thing in areas that have really high population, or sorry, have really high elevations. Alaska, for a number of reasons, does not have those city centers, but Denali certainly does not have them because of how high they are. So in this case, mountains can tell us about an area because usually when you have a lot of mountains, you don't have a lot of people. To look over the fauna aspect of physical characteristics, and again, the flora is the plant life, I'm going to use Rand McNally World Atlas again, which I used in episode 2, and again, you're going to have the opportunity to have your own login for this if you haven't already done that. I'm going to go over here to the layers, and in the environmental section, I'm going to click on vegetation, which is just another fancy word for plant life, and I'm going to click on this. And the legend for this layer over in the right hand corner basically says that where you see dark green on this map, these are areas where there's going to be a lot of vegetation. It's a lot of rain. The temperature is good for plants to grow. Maybe not all year, but for a lot of the year. You can see that the areas in the Midwest that have a lot of agriculture and farming are pretty green. You see along the coast, especially up here in the Pacific Northwest where Seattle and Portland, Oregon would be. Those are areas that get lots and lots of rain, so you see lots of vegetation, lots of plant life. And not surprisingly, right here, where if you look closely, you can see Death Valley National Park. That's a desert area, so you're not going to see a whole lot of vegetation, and that's a paler kind of beige color, and that just means you're not going to see a lot of vegetation. If I pull back, and now we'll talk on a more global scale, here's Brazil. If you see this line right here, that's the Amazon River. That's one of the longest rivers in the world. It is the widest river in the world. Just basically a large, humongous body of water going over the northern parts of South America. And around that area, that's where you're going to see lots of rainforests, tons and tons and tons of vegetation, all sorts of different kinds of plants. That's why you see dark green. And if you look in the northern part of Africa, you see the exact opposite. And that's because that's where the Sahara Desert is covering. The Sahara Desert by itself is actually bigger than the entire United States. And again, because it's a desert, we're not going to see a lot of plant life. So those are physical characteristics that give us clues about an area as well. And the way those physical characteristics, those examples of plant life, give us clues about an area, where this grows is very different than where this grows, and both of those are very different than where this grows. So our palm tree, obviously, it is in more of a tropical climate. That's the one in the middle. The saguaro cactus is going to be it can be growing in the desert. There's actually a Saguaro National Park in Arizona where you can see those. And then we have spruce trees all the way to the right, which are evergreen trees, and they can survive all year. And if you see a spruce tree, you know that you're talking about a place where it's going to get a little bit colder. It tells you about the climate. It tells you about the area. You're not going to see a spruce tree growing in Hawaii. You're not going to see a palm tree growing in Saguaro National Park, and you're not going to see a saguaro cactus growing in either one of those two areas. And the last of our physical characteristics, and there certainly are a lot more, we're going to talk about animal species and animal life. And clearly, this guy is going to be living in a more colder Arctic area. You see these in the upper regions of the northern hemisphere. A polar bear is not going to be able to live where the camel survives, and vice versa. The camel would not be living for a long period of time at all if they were up in the Arctic Circle, and the polar bear would not be able to adapt to the desert climate of the Sahara Desert. If you have one of these monsters, that kind of gives you an idea. Also, you're going to find those in more tropical, swampy areas, or in this case, golf courses. And this also is part of the reason why I don't go golfing very often, because if I saw one of these things, I'm not sure exactly what I would do with myself. So here we're looking at another example of a physical characteristic. This would be farmland, a field of wheat or grain of some kind. And where we get into human characteristics is when we talk about buildings. Now, this kind of building in the middle of this farmland would not be all that weird. We expect to see a barn in the middle of farmland. You see the tractor inside there. That looks like it belongs there. This, not so much. And there's a reason why. Because skyscrapers are built in areas where there's lots and lots of people. There's really nowhere to expand side to side, so they just build the buildings up because that's the only direction they can go. And they get their name because, again, they kind of scrape the sky. This, a skyscraper in the middle of a field of wheat, looks about as ridiculous as if you have New York City with the Statue of Liberty and there's a barn. Now, the barn is the one that looks out of place because we don't ordinarily see that in a city. So, again, the type of structure, the type of buildings that the humans are building gives us a clue about that area and what that area is being used for. The same thing could be said for the modes of transportation and the vehicles that are used in a place. If I have a subway car, that's a mode of transportation they're not going to find in cities, and they might call it different things. I think in Boston they call it the T, in Chicago they call it the L because it's an elevated train. It actually goes above the city. In San Francisco they call it the BART, which stands for Bay Area Rapid Transit. But these are trains that are meant to take people just around the city. They're not going to leave the city, or if they do, they don't go too far from the city. And you need these in areas that have lots and lots of people that are trying to get around, either to get to work or to get home or to go out to see a play or whatever it is they're doing. You'll see these a lot in big cities. You're not going to see them in agricultural areas or rural areas, just like you're not going to see one of these, for the most part, in a major city. However, if you're driving through farmland, you see them all the time because this vehicle is used by humans, and that's, again, a clue that it gives us about the area. If you're in a place like Venice, Italy, which is an old city, where they get around by something called a gondola, and that's because instead of streets for parts of the city, it's basically just a canal. And the way you get around, and it's mostly for tourists now, but the way you get around is by one of those fellows there in a striped shirt rowing you around, and if you're lucky, he might sing you a song. Isn't that nice? And the last part of human characteristics that we'll cover on this video is cultural. And culture could be a lot of different things. It could be different traditions. At its most basic, it's actually just languages that are spoken by people. It could be religions, it could be a whole bunch of different things. And this map here is showing us the countries that are in green are countries that officially speak Spanish as their official language. So obviously Spain, which is up here, is a Spanish-speaking country. But this also kind of gives us a clue about the history of the area that you're talking about. Because if you look here, you have Mexico, you have all these Central American countries like Nicaragua, Panama. You have Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, which are right here, and a lot of South American countries like Chile and Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia. These are all countries that speak Spanish as their primary language, and that's because just like we were a colony of the United Kingdom or Great Britain, these countries were at one point in time a colony of Spain. So they share a common language. That's something that's made up by humans. It's a human characteristic, and it tells us about the area, it tells us about the culture of the area. So we'll finish up this video back where we started, which was at Google Earth, and what we're looking at right now is actually a football stadium, even though you don't see the football lines painted on there. Must have been taken in the off season, but this is called Sports Authority Field. That's where the Denver Broncos play. And this kind of goes against what I told you before about how mountains usually equal very few people. Denver's a pretty big city, and if you look at the elevation down here, 5,201 feet. 1 mile above sea level is 5,280 feet. So if you look at the sign here where it says Sports Authority Field at Mile High, Denver is actually nicknamed the Mile High City, and that's because the elevation is actually very, very high. In spite of that, there's still a lot of people. If I pull back from Sports Authority Field, and we'll get higher and higher now. If I look just to the west of where Denver is located, you're right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, and that's where the elevation gets really high. If you look in the corner, then now we're getting to 8,000, 9,000. At the highest peaks in the Rocky Mountains, you're talking about 14,000 feet high. So Denver is kind of an exception to that. So it's an interesting city to take a look at because of the fact that they are able to survive and thrive with a population of over 500,000 people. In fact, it's almost 700,000 people who live in Denver, even though they're pretty much right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. So that's going to conclude our episode 3 on place. Take a look at episode 4, which is our next one, and that is all about human environment interaction, which discusses how the people are affected by and how they affect the environment around them. See you then.